Okay, I'm going to talk here about the necropolitics of the algorithm AI assemblage. So, one of the readings this week, I think, is one of the best books written about the things we've been talking about in this course, by the Australian researcher Kate Crawford, who's been an academic and also worked for some of these companies over the years. It's incredibly well researched. She traveled the world, observing a lot of the stuff that's writing about in this book with her own eyes, and goes through a number of different kind of levels of how the data industry and what she calls the atlas of AI, kind of sketching it all out, both spatially and conceptually. She looks at levels of Earth, labor, data, classification, effect, state, and power. Um, there's a kind of more kind of high level conceptual version of this done by a guy called Benjamin Bratton called the stack. So if you're kind of theory minded, that's a kind of another way of looking at this kind of levels as well. She looks at the Earth through the kind of environmental and human birthplaces of planetary computation networks. And here it's like the way that trees are kind of cut down for latex, cables underneath the ocean, all these different kind of physical earth and environmental aspects of this kind of huge global system. She looks at the labor, not just the way that kind of labor is really important in terms of still producing the materiality of the things needed, whether it's mining coltan or producing iPhones or building data centers. The way that AI systems are increasingly used to control labor, controlling bodies in space and time. It's always been a key kind of want of the ruling class to be able to control and track and manipulate and exploit their workers more and more. She writes about data, how data now is essentially an infrastructure, and this kind of changes our relations to both each other in terms of power relations, kind of all relations really. We obviously looked at that in through um, many aspects throughout the course, and also the notions of classification. Again, subjects of value, uh, postcodes of power, and all that kind of stuff. Here, those technical schemes, as we've looked at throughout, enforce hierarchies and magnify inequities. She looks at, I think, a really interesting chapter on effect, and particularly through the notion of facial recognition and how they're increasingly kind of treating facial recognition as kind of being able to reveal someone's inner emotional state. This is kind of, a huge billion-dollar industry, I'd say, since the book's written. It says 17 billions there, and we wouldn't be surprised if it's hundreds of billions by now. She talks about how the state is central to all these relations as well. Military logics in particular have been key to the creation of many of the kind of technologies and systems that we've been talking about throughout the course. And this kind of then skewers relations between state and subjects. And this relates to, the notions of power, how much of this kind of relations are through logics of capital, policing, and increasingly militarization. So I think this a kind of a key concept to think through this is Membé's notion of necropolitics. Um, Membé writing largely through the lens of kind of global kind of consumer and production relations, and certainly through colonial relations in terms of like who gets to live and die in terms of that. Um, Essentially, necropolitics is the politics of who gets to live and who gets to die, who gets to decide what human life counts and what is valued. Membé's incredible work has been really influential. Suicide bombers to slavery to apartheid in South Africa, theorizing kind of the post-colonial world of who gets to live and die. And we can, relate this back to what I was talking about in a previous video about data colonialism, a lens to look through these relations. Um, Again, notions of national sovereignty, when nation states control what happens within their own borders, that was ignored, in colonial contexts. People come in and essentially just kind of extract, appropriate, kill. This was illegal, but like, inventing notions of terra nullius and the like to kind of get past those legalities. But again, essentially enforcing your own will, your own wants, your own power, largely through violent means. Membé argues that this kind of colonial relations and states of exception such as war are just increasingly the norm for many people across the world, in the majority world. What's in symbolically violent ways referred to as the third world or the developing world in the West. Um, some countries can seem to like just basically do what they want with impunity, the US being a good example of this, despite international organizations such as the UN having laws. You know, if you've got enough military might and enough economic power, you can largely get away with doing what you want. For Membe, this leaves many populations, millions, billions of people kind of left in what he calls this kind of position of being the living dead, stuck with kind of life and death, the constant threat of death hanging over these people. This is unimaginable for most people in the global north, even those even though many in the global north increasingly seem to express their lives through kind of fear and precarity. They're not really, for the most part, under any real physical threats, and they only really view these things through the media, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a sec. Um, And Valencia has the Mexican researcher also has an interesting way of thinking about this in terms of the way that we, in the kind of privileged world, experience these relations through what they call gore capitalism, built on the idea of necropolitism and necropolitics, to argues that violence itself is now key to how we understand what's going on in the world, and really it's kind of undisguised these days. These kind of relations are increasingly viewable through our platforms, through social media, people posting about them. But we kind of in the West just kind of accept these and tend to just kind of watch it really as almost entertainment. Now, that sounds a little bit offensive by those out there that really care about kind of what's going on in war zones or in terms of consumer politics. But in the end, you're kind of viewing it through through a medium. And while you may kind of experience different emotions, it's not necessarily a kind of physical relation. You're not under threat yourself in terms of death. And we kind of increasingly viewing those images through the same lenses in this kind of huge kind of simulacra in kind of Baudrillard sense. It's sometimes hard to tell the difference between, say, what's going on in the news and what's a movie or whatever. Valencia kind of uses the drug market in the US as a really good example of this, and particularly the way that relatively privileged people, white collar workers taking cocaine kind of benefit from the the gang wars and the violence that happens in Mexico. They kind of get a double advantage really of being able to kind of have fun taking the drugs and then kind of see watch the news and see the violence and kind of see that as a form of entertainment. So these are kind of very overtly critical understandings of what's going on in terms of particularly those in the West's subject position. And throughout the kind of course, we've been touching upon some of these human costs. And there's certainly a kind of global relations of digital politics, digital necropolitics, that I think it's really important that we acknowledge and try and do something about. And I'll talk about coltan mining and Apple laborers in more detail in a minute, but things like drone strikes, these are good examples of necropolitics of the AI algorithmic assemblage. Increasingly AI is used to decide who gets to live and die. People are labeled in ways that using data that should not be really being used to label them. People are dying of the results. Other kind of ways of thinking about this is chemical waste and who gets to live near the dumping grounds of the digital platform capitalism. Increasingly in the future, things like water shortages. We're seeing in the US now whole towns basically losing their water supply when huge water guzzling data centers are opening next to them. This is obviously going to have effects on health. In an increasingly drying, climate change world, water's going to become a more valuable resource. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, where people were writing about the future through a kind of post-climate change lens, many were imagining that future wars will be over water. Again, so there's a kind of future necropolitics that may play out here. As Membe points out, and again relating to that notion of core capitalism, the calculus of life passes through the death of the other. Who gets to live and die in this system? Who basically has to die for us to have our iPhones and to have our ChatGPT is a way of thinking about what necropolitics is in this kind of platform capitalist world. So some examples here, over 10, 15 years ago now, was Apple came under fire because there was um, a growing instance of workers in Chinese factories that are making the iPhones committing suicide under the terrible, harsh conditions that they were put under. Rather than do something about the labour conditions, Apple put up nets. Foxconn, the provider, put up nets. So I think couldn't be a better symbolic representation. Well, it's not so symbolic about, but the broader power relations that are going on here. Now, note there, I've kind of said the suicide of offshored labored Apple laborers at China's Foxconn factories. Apple tries to maintain plausible deniability that they're not Apple's laborers. They're actually Foxconn laborers. We kind of employ Foxconn to do this stuff, so they're not directly employed by Apple. And this kind of offshoring is a key way that these kind of companies try and shirk their responsibilities when it comes to these labor relations. Another example that's been ongoing, and is in a wonderful book now that's quite old now, called in that Amazing Resources series done by Polity Press, probably again 10 or 15 years ago, about the kind of necropolitics of our digital devices, how it relates to, say, coltan, a key mineral needed to make capacitors and capacitors and resistors, I think, in terms of how phones are made. There's a lot of information there, but essentially, like in countries in Africa, particularly in the Congo, but others as well, there's young boys, anywhere upwards of like 8, essentially been human trafficked and used as slave laborers in these, very dangerous mines, with not a lot of kind of equipment, often done by hand through all kinds of weather and all kinds of risks, and many are dying, and many are just kind of completely exploited and living their lives as slaves. Again, the iPhone is the result of these kind of human relations. This is again an excellent example of the kind of hidden human costs and the necropolitics of the digital world. So I think Chuliaraki's understanding of this through the notions of the spectatorship of suffering and the ironic spectators, I think, is a good way of, I think, summing up rather privileged subjectivity here. Essentially, in the West, and in relatively comfort, we view all this kind of stuff. We kind of know about it, even though we kind of pretend we don't. There's a reflexive complicity going on here. We experience the kind of death and earthquakes and tsunamis and stuff like that that happens in other countries, and the labor relations that I was just talking about through the media. There's a sense of compassion fatigue here. Things come and go in terms of importance. We kind of know we live in an exploitative system and just kind of get on with it anyway and feel like there's not much we can do. And so she argues this leads to a result where, and I'll read this quote out, spectators are confronted with a diffused and often confusing collage of sufferings, each seeking to make its own bid for public attention, while it offers them no rational weighing the claims one against the other. In making it impossible to judge which different suffering matters the most, the media create an ethical vacuum in the voice of justice, and this is what may create compassion fatigue and inhibit action. I think this makes a lot of sense, but I think maybe we've moved beyond that now. Like the idea that like people have compassion, I think, is increasingly disappearing out of our politics. You can particularly see now that it seems like actually promoting like meanness, suffering, violence is the norm now in our political sphere, particularly in the US, but also increasingly in Australia as well, where we have increasingly right-wing relationship of politics happening more and more in the mainstream as the open window shifts right. So it's, for some ways, like I feel this is kind of a little bit dated, but I do think the notion of us being an ironic spectator. Such spectators often feel empathy and anger about injustices to the extent that they may express it through Facebook posts or wearing a wristband or whatever, but we mostly just kind of get on with our own lives. So is the ironic spectator the subject position of us all online now, particularly the more privileged white people in the West? I think that's a kind of open empirical question. I think it probably has quite a bit of accuracy, but it's not to say that it's kind of individual consumers' fault. Certainly those with power, those that kind of run things, are the ones I think we should be most targeting our blame on, most targeting our action towards. And you can see even in like recent years, just how reluctant politicians are to kind of regulate or engage with these kind of huge platform capitalist companies, whether that's on tax reform, whether that's on, data control, whether that's on making them accountable. It seems that much of the political class is either in their pocket or scared of them in various ways. So the relations of power here between the state, between the companies and capitalist ruling class kind of tech bros, and between us as those that kind of have to live and die, and as the results of those relations um, isn't as simple as just the fact that we can all put down our phones and it's going to, they'll have to change what they're doing because, phones themselves have become infrastructure in our day-to-day lives. We have to kind of use them for almost everything. Um, but as, I've touched upon throughout the course, there are increasing ways of thinking about resisting this, and I think it's important that we all try and do that. Okay, I'll leave it there.